Hello, everyone, and my name is Tamisha Bino, and welcome to the launch event of the latest publication by UNIDIR's Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone project, which is entitled Perspectives, Drivers, and Objectives for the Middle East WMD Free Zone, Voices from the Region. The publication was edited by myself and two of my UNIDIR colleagues who are also with us, Chen and James Revill. This publication is a collection of essays by experts from 8 different states in the Middle East, which all aim to identify the perspectives, drivers, and objectives of their country for the zone as they see them. So as I mentioned, we have a long event ahead of us, so thank you for being so patient. I just have some quick logistical details at the start. So as you have heard, the webinar is on the record, it is being recorded, and the recording will be posted later on UNIDIR's YouTube channel. My colleague Letitia, our facilitator, has left a message in the chat with her email if any of you need help with technical issues or have any questions. She also has some information about the Q&A that will follow each of the sessions. So with that out of the way, I'll now hand over to Mr. Tom Markram, Deputy to the High Representative and Director of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, for opening remarks. So Tom, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamisha, and Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends. It's a great pleasure for me to make some brief opening remarks in this event to launch the publication Perspectives, Drivers, and Objectives for the Middle East WMD Free Zone, Voices from the Region. I congratulate UNIDIR and thank the European Union for supporting their Middle East WMD Free project. Progress on achieving a Middle East free zone free of nuclear and all weapons of mass destruction has been elusive since its conceptualization nearly 50 years ago. Initiating a negotiation process through General Assembly Decision 73/546 has put states from the region firmly in the driving seat, and the 2 successful conferences convened in 2019 and in 2021, chaired respectively by Jordan and Kuwait, mark significant and concrete steps forward. The conference sessions have provided the opportunity for states from the region to engage in direct dialogue on arrangements that could address their security requirements, and the second session has also decided to establish a working committee as a standing forum to continue deliberations during the intersessional period between the annual sessions. It held its first organizational meeting on the 24th of March, and they've agreed to meet for 2 further sessions this year to continue the substantive deliberations on 4 issues, including an outline or a structure of the future zone treaty. UNIDIR's Middle East WMD Free project in general, and the publication and the project that they are launching today serve exactly the purpose of such dialogue, in creating both the physical as well as the intellectual space for it. The publication is unique in several aspects. Firstly, all 8 essays were written by regional experts that represent diverse range of positions on a set of issues that they were asked to address regarding the zone. Secondly, the majority of discussions on the Middle East WMD Free Zone to date have focused on the threats it is meant to address and the security benefits of WMD elimination and prohibition in the region, and hardly any have looked at any of the benefits that the zone would offer to its members. Through the framework of incentives, security, reputational, economic, and assistance measures, this new publication aims to do just that. Third, the authors were encouraged to look inward to their country's own national objectives and develop positions for the future treaty to serve these objectives, which in turn might reinvigorate their engagement in the zone process and provide far more clarity on the way forward. It's also important to recognize that authors identified incentives materializing not only through arriving at the desired outcome for establishing a Middle East WMD free zone, but also see incentives and benefits emanating from the actual process itself. That is to say, the setting up and the structuring of the negotiations. So I know we have a long day ahead of us, so I'm going to keep it brief, and I look forward to our discussions today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tom, for those opening remarks. You really set the scene for me and for the discussion panels to follow. As is in the agenda, I'll be just giving a quick introduction to the publication for those of you who haven't had the chance to read it, but also to sort of set the scene for the discussion sessions as well. As was already mentioned, the brief that was given to the authors was to identify these perspectives and incentives and objectives as they see them for their country for engagement with the zone. And we've made a specific focus on looking at both the process as well as the outcome, which would be a treaty. I should note here that each author wrote in their personal capacity, and the essays do not necessarily represent the official position of the country's author. Each author also considered the disincentives or missing incentives, as we've called them, that may have precluded their country's engagement with the zone so far, or the level of engagement. Overall, the publication aims to present different perspectives on factors that helped or hindered engagement in three ways. First, it provides a deeper understanding of the political, economic, and security concerns and priorities of states in the region, and their specific concerns related to the zone. Second, it helps highlight points of convergence that can be built upon and points of divergence that would need to be bridged. And finally, it hopes to inform the design of ongoing and future processes and initiatives on the zone specifically and regional security more broadly. So with this publication, we've also included a chapter on our key findings, the editors, as well, and this was based on a cross-analysis of the essays, as well as discussions among the authors that were conducted during a closed roundtable, which was held during the development phase of the essays last year. In the following two panels, the authors will discuss their essays, as well as the publication's findings as a whole. So in the first session, we will be looking at the strategic context of the zone, the objectives and concerns that the zone is meant to address, as well as some of the challenges and obstacles that it faces. And in the second session, the authors will discuss possible elements and pathways for a zone treaty that are required to achieve the strategic objectives of the states in the region. For example, regional cooperation, confidence building measures, other related security threats, as well as the role of external parties and existing international institutions. So to kick things off, I'll just give a brief overview of the key findings and conclusions of us editors. Letitia, if you would just share the presentation. Moving to the first slide, as you can see, there's a breakdown into country and type of the identified essays. So all authors identified security incentives, and this is no surprise as the zone would be a security tool primarily. Two authors identified security disincentives at the same time, and one identified a missing incentive. In terms of reputational incentives, 5 out of 8 viewed positive incentives in this regard, 2 found disincentives. And finally, 3 authors also identified economic incentives as well as ones related to assistance. The main finding overall has been that although quantitatively speaking, as you saw, the incentives that were identified outnumber those that are disincentives or missing incentives. But this has not resulted in more active participation or progress toward establishing the zone over the years. So that's why a closer look, as you'll see in the publication, a closer qualitative look, I should say, shows that for some states, even though they viewed a lot of incentives coming out emanating from the process or the treaty, those were outweighed by the disincentives, which they viewed as more important or more critical for their security. And we will hear more about this from the authors in the following discussion. Another key finding from the essays is that despite changes in the political and security environment of the Middle East, as we heard from Tom, over 50 years have passed, it is clear from both the essays and the roundtable discussion that the security concerns and general positions of states on the negotiation and outcome of the zone process have indeed changed very little. And finally, and this is a positive note, all authors expressed a need and a genuine desire for regional security dialogue. Although the contours of such a dialogue do differ or may differ among the authors, there is agreement that the zone process can create many opportunities for such a dialogue to address sources of mistrust in the region, whether through the negotiation of the zone, preceding its negotiation and establishment, or in parallel to it. So with that brief introduction to the publication, I'll stop here and hand over to my colleague, Dr. Jamie Revill, who will moderate our first discussion panel.
Thank you very much, Tamisha, and thank you indeed to all of the panelists and participants joining this first discussion session. My name's James Revill. I'm the head of the WMD program at UNIDIR, and I'm privileged to be able to moderate this session in which we're going to look at drivers and objectives of a zone. Before getting into the discussion, I should point out this has been a really interesting area to study. I think as Tamisha's overview demonstrated, all of the authors identified security incentives in their essays as feeding into a driver for the zone. It was also particularly interesting to note that at least one of the essays refers not just to the benefits of an output in the form of a treaty or an agreement, but also the process as well, something raised by both Tom and Tamisha earlier. Yet, while security incentives are clearly very important, there are other possible types of incentives and disincentives that could be considered. And this kind of relates to the wider literature around arms control and disarmament, which points to, for example, reputational or prestige-related benefits from joining arms control and disarmament agreements. Signing and ratifying these sorts of agreements is often associated with elevating international standing, which in turn can open up other benefits. And I raise this because I think it's important to keep in mind there may be other possible reasons why states might wish to engage in these sorts of processes more generally. And I think this is borne out in 7 of the 8 essays which identified reputational benefits for their country's engagement with the Middle East WMD-Free zone, and seeing this as a means to progress with other possible objectives. In order to discuss this further and get into a little bit more detail, I am privileged to be joined by 4 seasoned experts in this field. In no particular order, first we have Professor Nasser Hadian, who is Professor of Political Science in the Faculty of Law at the University of Tehran. His areas of scholarly and research interests include Iranian contemporary politics, Iran's nuclear program, and political Islam. And he is the author of several articles covering issues such as the nuclear debate in Iran. Professor Hadian holds a PhD in political sciences from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And thank you, sir, for joining us today. Second, we have Ambassador Karim Haggag, who is the Director of the Middle East Studies Center at the American University in Cairo and Professor of Practice within the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, as well as also serving as a non-resident fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He is a career Egyptian diplomat with over 25 years of service in the diplomatic corps. And thank you again for joining us. Third on my list, I have Dr. Hiba Husseini, who is the managing partner at the law firm of Hussaini & Hussaini. Hiba also chairs the legal committees to the final status negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis, and she has served as the legal advisor to the peace process negotiations since 1994. She is also a member of several local, regional, and international working groups on the peace process, covering topics including trade and economic relations and the status of Jerusalem. Ms. Husseini holds a Juris Doctor from Georgetown University. And thank you also for joining us, Hiba, and taking the time to speak with us today. And fourth on my list, but by no means last, we have Dr. Hussain Al-Shahristani, the former Deputy Prime Minister for Energy Affairs in Iraq since from 2010 to 2014, I think. And he also served as Iraq's Minister for Oil, a position he has held between 2006 and 2010. He is also an educator and a researcher with over 35 years experience in study and engagement in Iraq, in the UK and in Canada. And notably has been awarded the Roosevelt Freedom from Fear Award in 2012. Dr. Al-Shahristani holds a PhD in nuclear chemistry from the University of Toronto. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us here, and please forgive my terrible pronunciation as well of your names. I'm sorry, I'll try better moving forward. A couple of housekeeping points, if I may. As Tamisha pointed out with the essays, our panelists today are speaking in their personal capacity. And in terms of the process, I'll open with some big questions to kick off the discussion, but I'd also encourage those of you in the audience to engage. And there are 2 routes through which to do this. We can take questions through the Q&A button at the bottom. It should be at the bottom of your Zoom window somewhere. Please feel free to type in questions. Alternatively, if you wish to take the floor, then if I could encourage you to please raise your hand, and then we'll enable you to turn on your microphones and your screen so you'll be visible. We will try and get to as many questions as possible, but please do bear with me. So with that in mind, I'd like to start our discussion by exploring some of the security and threat perceptions that have been outlined in the panelist essay. So a question really to all panelists to begin with is really related to what do you feel are the main sources of WMD related security threats from the perspective of your respective countries? And I'll open this to all. If I could encourage you to try to keep your answers to below 5 minutes, but partly because I don't want to interrupt you, but I also think it's important we hear all the voices that we can. So I do encourage you to try and keep to below 5 minutes. But with that in mind, perhaps I could begin with you, Karim, to start us off. In your essay, you talk about some of the reasons for Egypt's championing or co-championing of the zone as related to Egyptian threat perceptions. So could you elaborate on these perceptions and how you see this sort of evolved and how the zone could address those perceptions? And please, I'll hand the floor over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you to UNIDIR for sponsoring this publication and for this very important event. So Egypt took the initiative to propose the idea of a WMD-free zone, basically out of a general concern about the problem or the security challenge that WMDs posed for regional security in general. It was not that any particular WMD capability posed a specific threat to one or more states in the region, but it was a problem of how WMDs were a source driving insecurity in the region. So first, we had the assessment that the proliferation of WMD capabilities in the region were accentuating military imbalances, and therefore they constituted a source and a driver of further proliferation to overcome these imbalances. Israel's nuclear monopoly in the region was certainly one example of this, but it was not the only example. Right? Over the course of the last 5 decades, we've seen proliferation in every class of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. So the WMD capabilities were a source of regional proliferation. Secondly, Egypt's assessment at the time that it launched the WMD Free Zone initiative was that these weapons figured more prominently in the region's armed conflicts and arenas of regional security competition. We've seen their use in the Iran-Iraq war. We've seen how they were a very salient feature in the first Gulf War. We've seen how they figured very prominently in arenas such as Syria, such as Libya, and of course the ongoing issue with Iran's nuclear program. So these weapons themselves came to figure very prominently in regional conflicts. And then finally, the concern on Egypt's part was that in the absence of a viable regional arms control process, these repeated proliferation challenges that I mentioned have been dealt with almost exclusively through the use of either military force or coercive diplomacy. So that in and of itself was another contributing factor of regional instability. And we've seen examples of this again over the course of the last few decades, right? The Osirak attack by Israel on Iraq's nuclear reactor in 1991, the forced disarmament of Iraq after the first Gulf War in 1991, the 2007 bombing by Israel of Syria's nuclear reactor, the cyber attacks and counterattacks between Israel and Iran with respect to Iran's ongoing nuclear program. So we've seen the resort to counter-proliferation as the preferred method of addressing this challenge of weapons of mass destruction, as opposed to the arms control process that would lead to a zone, that would be the preferred process or route to address this growing challenge. So it was really a combination of these factors that drove Egypt's security calculus in proposing the WMD-free zone as a comprehensive framework that would guarantee security for all states in the region, but at lower levels of arms.
Thank you, Karim, for opening this discussion session with remarks which I think are also a reminder of the complexity and the longevity of this topic. Perhaps now I may turn to Professor Hadian. Nasser, if I may. I'd like to invite you to take the same question, but I was also struck by the fact that in your contribution to the report, you also talk a little bit about reputational risks associated with programs. So I wonder whether you could elaborate on those and how the zone could perhaps play a role both in alleviating threats from the Israeli programs, but also reputational risks that could emerge as well. And I'll hand the floor over to you, please, Nasser. The floor is yours, sir. You're muted, Professor Hadian.
Yes,
I'm
unmuted. Thank you very much, and I appreciate it for giving a chance to me to share with you some of my ideas. First of all, as I have discussed in the report, I have a problem with the whole idea and concept of the Middle East, the zone belonging to the Middle East, but I don't want to discuss it now here. So it's good to look at it, to look at my piece in the publication. That what is my argument there. But regarding your specific question, you know, we have been victim of the use of chemical weapons. What we saw in the world was basically silence or support, particularly of the West and the Americans from Saddam, and he used chemical weapons against its own people and against us. So it has a tremendous impact on our strategic calculus regarding constructing a defense which can counter that threat in the future, both in terms of deterring and also in terms of creating defense. So that's why when you see the missile program, so much attention now on the missile program. So it emerged from that calculus, basically why we have to develop such a kind of a missile in order to deter the potential use in the future. But as I have argued, in fact, for the first time in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I guess in 2003 or 2004, October, what I said there was that Iran does not want weapons. We don't want to weaponize our nuclear program. What we are looking for is capability. At the time, I mean, when I said we are looking for the capability, that was the first time which that term used for our program. And I said we don't want weapons because we know that if we have it, the others are going to follow suit. They want to have it as well. And there is going to be a race for weaponization. And then that would create more instability. Not only our security is going to be increased, rather our vulnerabilities are going to be increased. That's why it is not into our interest to push to weaponization, because the others are going to follow suit. And since we are in a, we all live in Middle East, it would, and most probable vehicle of use of such a weapons would be missiles. So it would take 2-3 minutes, 5 minutes at most, for these missiles hit important and significant strategic places in another country. So that would be hard to imagine that how within 5 minutes we can detect and destroy such a kind of a weapons. That's good for the Israelis to particularly take the note of that, no matter how strong their anti-missile system would be, but still once there is enough number of such missiles, that would create a problem for them as well. So that's the same thing for Iran. So for any strategist sitting in Tehran, that would be hard to imagine that we are going to deal with such a kind of a problem. Thus, we are all better off not to have these weapons in our zone. Of course, I have provided 14 reasons for Iran, and I have argued on the basis of those 14 reasons why we are not better off with the weapons and how it's going to increase our vulnerabilities. But I'm not going to go to those 14 reasons that why we don't need them. But I would like to add, if you permit me, one point, and that's about the demonization of Iran has been very important, because we have been so demonized that when chemical weapons was used against us, there was not a reaction from the world. We are afraid that if the situation comes to the point that Israeli use nuclear weapons against Iran, the backlash, the reaction in the world would be minimal. That's a very prominent and important question in our mind. Is world going to show a strong reaction to what they are doing now to Russian invasion of Ukraine? Or no, that would be just a little bit nagging of here and there and a condemnation, verbal condemnation of Israelis. That's a question mark which I would like to finish my talk with.
Okay, thank you, Nasser. I would refer participants to the publication for some of this interesting discussion around the geographical scope. I also suspect, Nasser, that issues of missiles and demonization are things that we will return to. So thank you for raising those points. I'd now, with your indulgence, I'd like to turn to you, Hiba, and I hope you might be able to provide a sort of Palestinian perspective on regional WMD threats and how you think these affect Palestine's security, and also how you think a zone could address some of these challenges. The floor is yours, please, Hiba. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, James, Tamisha, UNIDIR, and to be among these distinguished panelists. For me, it's a very challenging topic personally, and also for Palestine, of course. I mean, Palestine, of course, is an emerging state. Although others would like to call it an entity, but we would like to see ourselves a state, of course, emerging in this security zone, if you will. So for us, emerging as a nation, as a state, a free zone it provides a very major incentive for us, for our own security, in the traditional sense of the security, and of course in the wider security issues, nuclear and otherwise, on two levels. One, because our neighbor, of course, Israel, has superior security forces, and also, some colleagues have just pointed out, I mean, there could be security threats and the potential from third countries or between Israel and third countries, and we are in the midst of that space, if you will, the security space that Israel and Palestine occupy together. So given that geographical and geostrategic concept, we feel it is very important to have a free zone, and for our own security, and as a nation that is emerging. So we of course we will be positioning ourselves in the future in our relationship with Israel, because that's going to be our first partner, if you will, followed by Jordan, and of course, and Egypt next in terms of the geography, and the neighbors to the north Syria and Lebanon, and then within the region itself, of course. So we have, again, as a demilitarized state, we need to be assured that all these weapons of mass destruction that surround Palestine with all of its vulnerabilities we are not going to be caught up in that. So we have a major incentive, again, for our own insecurities and vulnerabilities as a demilitarized state to be part of a free zone within the region. And that we look forward, to having the cooperation at that level, and to have the confidence building measures so that we can reach that level. So it is our hope that the region would have a free zone in which we would be part and parcel.
Thank you, Hiba. Last but not least, I'd like to move on to get your views, Hussain. In your essay, you talk about the development of nuclear weapons under Saddam, and how this was triggered in part by the attack on the Ozark reactor in 1981, but also as a way to enhance Iraq's security. Given the changes in today's Iraq that we see, how do you think the zone would enhance Iraq's national security? Please, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you again for inviting us to such an important conference on the establishment of weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. Such a zone is viewed with utmost urgency and top priority in Iraq, simply because the Iraqis have very vivid memories of the use of chemical weapons in their country. The footage of innocent women and children falling dead on the streets of Halabja is a grim reminder to Iraqis of the dangers of such weapons in the region. Although Iraq does not have such weapons anymore, but it was among the very few countries that have suffered the consequences of the use of such weapons. Saddam Hussein, as has already been mentioned, used chemical weapons against his own population in Iraqi Kurdistan in March 1988. He used it, as Professor Nasser have said, in the Iran-Iraq war, not only against the Iranian forces, but against the Iranian civilians in border towns and villages. And that threat even remained in Iraq after Saddam, when some of the remnants of these weapons were left in the country, and the terrorists tried to access them when Daesh, ISIS, overran parts of the northwestern Iraq. The Middle East, as we all know, is a tension-prone region of the world. Unfortunately, it has been so for decades, and it may continue to be or to witness different types of tensions in the foreseeable future. So any military friction between Iraq's neighbors for any reason that can lead to exchange of weapons of mass destruction would have catastrophic impact on Iraq. Missiles or warplanes violating Iraqi airspace may be shot down on Iraqi territory. If any of these missiles or fighter planes carry weapons of mass destruction, it would expose the country and the population to very grave dangers. This is why Iraq is actively pursuing establishment of weapons of mass destruction. And we think, although this process has been going on, as has been mentioned, since 1974, but it's time that countries should really take it very seriously. We all know that all the countries of the Middle East, regardless of how we define it, but even with an expanded definition, all the countries have agreed to join conference to discuss and reach some kind of agreement on weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, except Israel. And we have heard, of course, the reasoning beyond that. But I would like to add here that Israel should understand that the position of WMD does not provide security to any nation, as the military confrontations in the Middle East in the past decade have shown. Israel's arsenal of nuclear weapons did not prevent the 1967 and 1973 wars with its neighbors, nor did Saddam's chemical weapons shorten the 8-year wars with Iran. Similarly, the use of chemical weapons by warring parties in Syria has not ended the civil war. The only guarantee for its security is a just resolution of the Palestinian problem by recognizing the right of the Palestinian people to live in peace and dignity in their homeland. This will guarantee Israel's security, not its nuclear arsenal. Another point that should also be borne in mind, that it's not only the state actors that we should be concerned about when we talk about WMD in the region. Terrorists can access such weapons as they've tried in Iraq and Syria. And having such weapons anywhere in the region can always tempt the terrorists to attempt to get their hands on them, and they be posing an extremely dangerous situation for not only the country where they are carrying on their activities as they did in Iraq and Syria, but also to the other parts of the region. That's why Iraq considers the threats of weapons of mass destruction are of extreme importance to all the people of the region, including the Israeli people, and we should all work really to get rid of them as soon as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Shahristani. I think that the Halabja is another grim reminder of the horrors of chemical weapons in the hands of both state and non-state actors. So thank you for raising that. And I suspect we might touch upon that again. Before proceeding to a second round of questions, I wanted to invite participants in the audience. Please do submit questions if you have those. If you have questions for our panelists. I will take another round of questions before we open it up, but if you want to submit questions through the Q&A, then that's most welcome. I should also note that we will have an Israeli panelist in the second part of the discussion section, so we'll hopefully there'll be in order to make sure we have a range of views that are represented. In the meantime, though, I want to start with another round of questions. All of the panelists have spoken a little bit about the importance of the zone, but I want to drill down to that a little bit more now. So I wonder whether the panelists could provide some further thoughts on how the zone would address the WMD threats and the other objectives and concerns that you have each described in your answers to the first set of questions. And also, I wonder how this would fit with the current process in New York that Tom referred to earlier in the opening remarks, and whether you think there could also be a requirement for complementary or parallel processes as well. This time around, if I may, I'd like to start with you, Nasser. You had several ideas in your chapter on the sort of structure of a process for the zone, and I was wondering whether you could elaborate on some of those ideas for us, how you see the zone contributing to Iranian objectives and interests, and how that progress would be a benefit. And please, the floor is yours, Nasser. You're muted again, so sorry, Professor, you're on mute. There you go. Yeah.
Thank you very much. In an ideal world, if we have that security structure in place, that would help, I guess, every country, every member country in that structure to feel safer, We should not be worried about the use of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. Thus, that's good enough incentive for everyone to embrace the idea. So, but my point is not that, I mean, in ideal world, we have this is good or bad. I doubt you can find anyone who would say, no, that's not a good idea. The point is the practicality, how possibly we can have such a structure. As I have argued, as I've been a part of many groups who have elaborated, discussed, debated this issue, unfortunately, I'm a little bit, not too much, a little bit pessimist about the possibility of that. Coming very much from a realistic view and realism of international relations theories, I don't see any chance why Israel should give up their weapons. Because, you know, it is not just a matter of providing security for them, which, as Hussain Al-Shahristani very excellently explained, you know, they faced several wars and those weapons could not help. To me, as time has passed, no longer those weapons are a means for security, for securing their interests, or for providing security for them. Rather, it is for projection of power. They feel that they can project power much easier. At the end of the day, they have a very superior conventional weapons. They can fight with anyone, but they know in the back of their mind, they have weapons, which is the ultimate power which someone can have in terms of destroying the others. So to me, that is the reason why they don't want, in fact, to participate in any sort of a serious talk regarding zone free of Middle East, zone free of WMD. And to be frank with you, what should they? Why should they? There's no incentive. There's no pressure. There's no sanction. Nothing there. They have all the back of West, basically, particularly the United States. So unless, unfortunately, unless some other countries, or at least one other country, has the weapons, then they find the incentive to negotiate seriously about getting rid of their weapons of mass destruction altogether. That would be good to emphasize the chemical, biological as well. That has been one of their concerns, that we should not single out only the nuclear weapons because we are the only one who have those weapons. Or, of course, they never acknowledge that they have, but everyone knows they have, and they know that fact too. So unless another country has, to me, no way which there is no way which we can convince them to get rid of those weapons. No amount of persuasion, no amount of incentives would be enough to convince them. Give them recognition, peace, security, they're all important, but it's still not enough for them to get rid of their WMDs. And that's very unfortunate. So in that regard, I'm a little bit pessimist that we can realistically move toward the zone. So that's why in the paper I argued, let's go for a security structure. Maybe there's a better chance than that they are being convinced. Although, as I said, I'm not very optimistic on that one, but there is a better chance. But if we go and concentrate on zone free of WMD, then you just cannot convince them to bring them in such a meeting in a serious way. there is a possibility that if we talk about economic cooperation, if we talk about security structure, that they may join seriously to talk about those issues. And as a result, we may be able to convince them to get rid of those weapons. Otherwise, if we begin with the zone free of WMD, we are not going to get any. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser, for some quite forthright remarks. I also understand the degree of pessimism around arms control and disarmament more generally at the moment, not specific to the Middle East WMD-free zone, but more generally, I think it's challenging times. I will point out, I mean, optimism is somewhat obligatory here at UNIDIR. I think you kind of need to have it looking at arms control and disarmament issues for a sustained period of time. And I would point out past crises have stimulated greater effort and energy towards arms control disarmament agreements, or perhaps the security structures or the other ideas you elaborate upon in your paper. But thank you for your frank remarks. I'd also encourage panelists to feel free to respond to each other's points, and I will offer you the floor, Nasser, again to respond in case you'd like to reply to any of your other panelists. But perhaps now I can turn to you, Hussain, and I'd be very interested in your response to the question, as well as your thoughts about the current dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or even the Abraham Accords on the zone as well, and the prospects for success there. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So far, there have been 4 meetings held in Baghdad between Iranian and Saudi representatives. The latest was in September last year. The 5th was scheduled to be held this month in Baghdad again, but Iran postponed it after the execution of over 40 people from the eastern region of Saudi Arabia. In the past meetings, there has been encouraging progress, I would say, on bilateral issues. It was evident that both sides were keen to diffuse the tension between them and reach out to begin building some kind of trust. Both sides realized that frank and honest discussions can clarify and perhaps solve bilateral issues and pave the way for diplomatic exchange, trade, and tourism, particularly to religious sites in both countries. However, there remains some thorny regional issues that have not been discussed yet, as far as we know, although the discussions have been closed and very short statements have been made after each session for the public. So I'm not saying that I know really anything more than what has been already spoken about particularly by the Iranians, because the Saudis have been very tight-lipped on the outcome of these sessions. But there are serious regional issues that I believe cannot be resolved bilaterally between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Rather, it requires a regional approach with the active involvement of concerned countries, such as the Yemen and Syria. These are the 2 areas where both sides have different views. I believe that it is extremely important to encourage both sides to continue these discussions in Baghdad or elsewhere, because Iran and Saudi Arabia are 2 very important actors in the current regional tensions, and without their direct participation in any kind of arrangement, I cannot see how some of the issues can be resolved. The fact that both countries have shown willingness to discuss openly between themselves and honestly their real positions has been very encouraging. And it is clear to me and to many others that there are some very deep-rooted differences between the two countries. But I believe that the leaderships in both countries have started to see the importance of them getting together to not only to discuss their bilateral relationship, but really to work together to reduce tension in this part of the world. And I really wish them best luck and invite all the other countries to encourage them to do so. That's my uptake of the discussions that have been going on in Baghdad between the Saudis and the Iranians.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Shahristani. I take note of the encouraging process on bilateral issues and the enthusiasm to diffuse tension, not willingness to discuss. I think that's important, but also we recognize the challenges you identify and the need for encouragement. I'm going to move on now. I would invite other panelists to respond to the comments of others should you wish, but in doing so, perhaps I can turn to you now, Karim. And in your paper, you talk about Israel's nuclear program as a driver beyond regional proliferation, but I wonder, how do you think the main concern you describe can be addressed in the current circumstances and the current participation in the process? So if I can hand the floor over to you, Karim. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So out of deference to UNIDIR's obligatory optimism, I'd like to turn to your question about the UN process, because I think the UN process on the zone represents a very important milestone. So this was really the first tangible sign of progress that was made with respect to the zone since the adoption of the NPT extension resolution, the Middle East resolution on the zone as part of the NPT extension conference in 1995. And the General Assembly resolution provides a very wide and expansive mandate for the UN conference, right? So the conference is mandated with formulating a legally binding treaty establishing a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and all weapons of mass destruction on the basis of arrangements freely arrived at by the states of the region. So given this wide mandate, this constitutes a very important opportunity for participating states to begin to grapple with the very substantive, challenging, and complex issues related to the zone. So to begin to discuss in a very serious way the obligations and prohibitions that would be involved in the context of the zone regarding all classes of weapons of mass destruction, including delivery systems. It would deal very substantively with the complex issue of verification, the challenging legal issue of entry into force, the scope of the zone, the geographic scope, also issues of regional security and regional security frameworks are also potentially a subject of discussion in the context of the conference. So this represents a very important milestone. Now, I think, again, going to your question, how can we complement that very important process? I would point to three things for the region and the international community to think about. First, I think it's time to give serious consideration to develop a CBM agenda, a regional CBM agenda that can begin to take root in the region. I think the dynamics, the emerging regional dynamics around the Abraham Accords point to the reality that peace between Israel and its neighbors has both widened and in some instances actually deepened. So this actually presents an opportunity to begin a serious CBM process in the region that can begin to generate trust and confidence. And the region, of course, has some history with this around the Acres process during the 90s, where CBMs were very much a part of the arms control process as part of the Madrid peace process during the first half of the 90s. Second, I think there's much work to be done on the conceptual and technical basis of the zone. So I think we need to remind ourselves that we do have nuclear weapons-free zones in a number of areas around the globe, but a zone free of all weapons of mass destruction is a novelty, right? That does not exist anywhere. And so that in and of itself requires, I think, much room for study, analysis, and the technical and legal work that needs to be done outside of the conference process around the many challenging issues that have to be addressed in order to actually envision what the zone would look like. And it's encouraging that there are a number of initiatives emerging from the region by different groups, non-state groups, NGOs, experts outside of the official channels that attempt to address this gap. Lastly, I think it's very important to consider what comes after a potential return to some variation of the JCPOA. Right? So the JCPOA, if we get back to if we have a return to the original agreement or some variation of the agreement, that in and of itself will be another very important milestone. What comes next, right? Because the JCPOA, some have argued, can certainly be a supporting factor to the idea of a zone and regional security in general, or it can be a factor contributing to other countries emulating the capabilities that Iran would be able to retain in the context of an agreement, especially with respect to enrichment capabilities. So I think it's very important that we consider how the JCPOA can be linked to a broader regional security process. And this goes back to what I think Professor Hadian was mentioning, right? So then rather than the JCPOA contributing to a hedging process in the region, it can be a spur or a catalyst for a broader conversation on regional security frameworks. That can involve CBMs, so integrating CBMs into this process. That can involve a discussion on a regional code of conduct for security. That can involve a discussion about potentially regionalizing some aspects of the JCPOA, so the verification provisions of the JCPOA, for example. So, but I think it's important not to leave a gap between a return to the JCPOA and a delay in considering a regional security process, because I think that gap would be detrimental to the overall regional security in the Middle East.
Thank you, Karim. There's some food for thought there in terms of CBM, agenda of technical legal, conceptual work on technical and legal basis, and then the JCPOA, what comes next, and whether this could be a catalyst for engagement. I will give all panelists the opportunity to comment on Karim's points. But first of all, I want to turn to you, Hiba, and I want to invite you to address the question on the role of the zone. But I'd also be very interested to get your views on ACRES, which I know you've been closely involved with over the years, along with other panelists as well. Mm-hmm. Which aspects of this process do you think are useful, and what do you think can be taken in terms of lessons learned for thinking about the zone today? Please, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think I'm both optimistic and pessimistic, so I share the concerns and the optimism that my colleagues have pointed out. I'm one who believes both, as Karim mentioned, and Professor Hadian, it's very conflicted and contradictory in a way. I mean, I believe in creating legal frameworks that work, that create the norms, the standards, code of conduct, if you will, Karim, because only through dialogue and CBMs and continued dialogue under like the auspices of the UN and other regional working committees and groups. So when we launched in 1992 the Arms Control and Regional Security Multilateral Working Group as part of the peace process that was taking place way back then, there were several regional committees at the time, water, economics, refugees, and of course, the arms control. Unfortunately, the arms control discussions lasted only a period of 3 years, and then they stopped. But there were, you know, the Russia and the US, if you recall, were the two international players, along with the other members of the international community that were leading the group discussions. And there was a lot of interest at the time to establish a regional dialogue and regional arms control. Of course, that discussion was not around nuclear weapons, but it was more conventional and traditional weapons. They succeeded to some extent to forge relationships, but of course we did not end up forming a group that had any continuity and sustainability, and eventually the discussions faltered, like they did on refugees, and maybe today we have some discussion on economic issues, more regional cooperation on trade and economy, simply because it's easier to discuss trade and economy, and easier to exert political will among the players in the region than create these partnerships. But part of it is, I think, to some extent, that Israel did not see the value of continuing the engagement. Remember, at the time, we also signed the interim agreement in 1995. So and we signed a security annex to the interim agreement with Israel. That is the Palestinians. So the need to keep the momentum going did not take place. Also, Jordan signed an agreement in 1994 with Israel, and the Wadi Araba agreement, and there were security annexes to that agreement. So the incentives again kind of lost their value, and there was no continuation. I think but it was very important as a start, and I think we could continue the dialogue under the free zone to create communication networks, to do research, to do more open dialogue on incentives, and because I think if we have this scenario that we have today, you know, just taking a look or judging at what is happening, and there's no comparison, of course, to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, but you have any party that sees its own self-interest to move forward and invade another country and to launch war. I think the potential for that is certainly present here, and with the level of there is no deterrent effects, if you will, on the ground to create and to contribute to any form of compliance among the regional players. And no standards to abide with. So I think if we create a scenario for a continued dialogue and push towards a greater political will to engage, I believe there would be some value for the discussion, but I am not optimistic that we would be able to reach that in any short period of time, because the balance here, I mean, and the imbalances are tremendous. So, of course, I'm speaking a little bit from a regional perspective, not from a purely Palestinian perspective, because we cannot even begin to impact and influence a regional dialogue from just a pure Palestinian perspective. But it is our interest, definitely as Palestinians, to have the dialogue continue, and because, again, we feel there's total imbalance there.
Thank you, Hiba. I think you raised a number of really important points there on creating scenarios and sustaining dialogue, keeping momentum going. So thank you. Just a totally separate note, it's quite pleasant to hear birds tweeting in the background. So thank you for that as well. And now
I have workers in the house, and it's a mess inside. So I'm in the garden.
Thank you, Hiba. I want to turn to a question from our participants now. And I think, Wael, if you wanted to raise a question, not a written one, but actually, if you want to turn on your screen and unmute, please, the floor is yours, sir, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, James. And thanks for the panelists for their excellent contribution. I have a question, but I have a remark that would lead to that question. I think the crux of the matter now in the idea of the zone lies in a remark that was mentioned by Ambassador Haggag and Professor Hadian. The first remark regarding that the existence of nuclear weapons in the hand of one country in the region creates an imbalance in the power structure and is a threat to regional security and to the national security of the states in the region, which I fully agree with. But when there is that threat to national security and to regional security, any region would take measures to alleviate that threat. Professor Hadian said, which I also agree with, that Israel has no incentive to give up their weapons. Actually, I was asked by an Israeli during the preparatory meetings we had in Geneva and Lyon with the Israelis and the Iranians, what's in it for us? As straightforward as that. So my question is 2 or 3 parts. First, would more CBMs and CSBMs and normalization of relation help in changing the Israeli mind regarding their monopoly on nuclear weapons? And the idea came to me when I asked myself that question, which I would like to put to everybody here. There is another scenario. The problem is that we cannot convince Israel. I know we cannot convince Israel as long as it can, as long as there are no pressure from the international community, not from us, from the international community on it. Therefore, there is this potential or question in my mind. Why aren't the Arabs, the Iranians, as a group, the region per se, are not using all their cards, whether economic, whether political, whether strategic, to put pressure on the international community in order to start having pressure on Israel? Because there is only demands inviting Israel to join, and there is no incentive. If I were Israel under these conditions, I wouldn't join. But the international community is totally silent, and we are not doing enough in the region to create pressure, to escalate this, the pressure and the situation. So escalation, that's my question. Is escalation a possibility? Could it produce better results in putting pressure on Israel to understand that regional security cannot work on that matter, or escalation and tensions became a bad word. We already have a lot of tension in the region. One last remark to Professor Hadian. He said that maybe it would be better not to work on the free zone, but to start with regional security. We have talked with that with the Israelis as well. And they said they are happy, they would be happy to discuss regional security issues without the nuclear file. The nuclear file is out of any discussion when it comes. So it would not help us in this course of trying to demolish the existence of these weapons in the region through a discussion of regional security. Maybe a discussion among us in the region without Israel could be productive for us. But my question is about, we are always looking at CBMs and de-escalation. Maybe it's time to escalate, raise the tension in political and strategic tools, because we haven't been doing that. Actually, we have been giving up our negotiating cards over the years. I mean, it's a provocative question of me, but we need to look at all scenarios. Is escalation a possibility? Thank you.
Thank you, Wael. I think that's a series of questions there which would be interesting to get the panelists' views. So just as a recap, would more CBMs and normalization help change the Israeli mindset? Why aren't states using economic, political and strategic cards to escalate pressure on the international community? And then a question specifically for you, Professor Hadian, on regional security first, related issues. I think, Nasser, as you were the first to speak last time, if I may open with you, and then I'll pass the floor to other panelists. But please, the floor is yours, Professor Hadian.
Thank you very much. While, as always, I really enjoy your points, your talk, your insights, and that's very beneficial for me. It has always been. So what I guess would like to mention is one fact. There is no way enough pressure from international community on Israel. I can say it's too much to say to do anything, but particularly to get rid of the nuclear weapons. This is the topic of our discussion. So we cannot count on that. They have the backing, the full backing, unconditional backing of the United States, and they know that they are going to enjoy that. They will enjoy that. Thus, we should not rely on presumption that there maybe under some circumstances there can be a pressure on Israel. No, that's one fact. Number two is, in fact, even if they use the chemical weapons against any country, not just Iran, there would be some nagging here and there, but at the end of the day, they are going to support it. They're going to say that, you know, Israeli were facing existential threats, so forth and so on. We know the line of argument, that how they are going to back even the use, not possession, the use of nuclear weapons. And they know that they have the full backing, even for the use of the nuclear weapons. So under what circumstances then we can be hopeful Israel to accept any sort of constraint on their program or getting rid of their program altogether? This is if another country has the weapon in the region, then they will be, to me, they will be ready to negotiate seriously about their program. Number two is we offer them a comprehensive package, all the countries, whom they think are serious or are threat or whatever. They think that they are significant countries. A comprehensive package of recognition, economic cooperation, I'm talking about diplomatic recognition, economic cooperation, and security arrangement. they may be then persuaded that, okay, it's worth to consider. If not elimination of their weapons, some sort of a constraint on their program, mechanism, or some mechanism of inspection and verification, so forth and so on. Absence of these, I'm afraid, I'm not optimistic about Israeli to agree or to accept any sort of restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nasser. It seems your remarks are stimulating interest. Karim, I'll turn to you shortly to take the 3 questions raised by Wael, and then also to Hiba and Hussain. Then I have questions from Ambassador Al-Mullah and Adnan, as well as a live question from Mr. Usnov. But firstly, Karim, please, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Yes, as usual, Ambassador Al-Assad's questions really focus the mind. I think what I have to say dovetails with what Professor Hadian already mentioned. But first, I would reformulate the question on Israel. You know, the question with respect to Israel is not whether it gives up its nuclear weapons or not. I mean, that is not the immediate question. Of course, that is, of course, the ultimate desired outcome. But the immediate question is whether Israel will agree to join a serious arms control process for the region that would eventually lead to the zone. Right? Now, that is a completely different question. Right? The zone process, however it's configured, will be long, will be multi-staged, will be complex. So we're talking about a multi-year, maybe even a generational effort, right? But the key factor here is Israel joining the process, right? And Israel, of course, has been very reluctant to do that, right? On account of the argument that's usually framed in terms of the slippery slope, right? Now that is an argument put forward by Israel that has hampered any attempt to institute a viable arms control process, which in my mind, should be the immediate objective. Right? Now, with regards to the question, you know, should it be pressure on Israel or any other state? Again, I would frame the issue somewhat differently. I think what we're seeing now is pressure on the region, right? Precisely because we don't have, or we have not had, an arms control process for the Middle East. That what we're seeing now is the creeping nuclearization of the region. And that, interestingly enough, is an assessment that we hear coming out more and more from Israeli analysts, not Arab analysts, right? So we see that very dire assessment coming out of Israel. So that in and of itself should be pressure enough or incentive enough on the part of regional states and on the part of the international community to try and galvanize momentum for a serious arms control and eventually disarmament process for the zone. Final point I'll make on this, you know, the very useful discussion we've been having on regional security, confidence building measures, so on. These are very important in themselves, but they cannot be a substitute for the zone process, right? For a process at the heart of which is a commitment to arms control and eventually disarmament. So the regional security and confidence building should be complementary to the zone process, not a substitute for it.
Thank you, Karim. If I could put the same set of questions perhaps to you, Hiba, if you'd like to respond to any of those or respond to comments from other panelists as well. The floor is yours, madam.
Well, I mean, I think since we're having a frank discussion here, I mean, it's going to take a great deal for Israel to be convinced that it is in its own interest to engage in a full discussion on the nuclear-free zone. So far, it doesn't see it's national interest that it's national can be achieved, and in a similar extent, it is also does not have the incentive to engage in a full resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So again, the question becomes what incentives, what would propel a shift in the region for Israel? Is it, as Professor Hadian is saying, it's anwa'il escalation, or building the power, the power of Iran at a level where it can convince Israel that they should be engaged? Of course, I'm not here to speak for Israel or any of the countries in the region, but I think for the interest of everyone in the region, and I have seen, here we are, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, 20 years plus in the making, and we are not there yet. Our relationship with Israel has broken down on many levels in terms of the political process, but let me give you an example. On the security cooperation, of course, and we're not talking about the level of nuclear, we're talking about the level even of traditional weapons here. Just the day-to-day activities, although it fails every once in a while, and we've seen this over the last couple of days, we've had escalation internally. Unless we really have the realization that we want to move in that direction, and we have, and it is in the best interest of us to achieve peace and security, and the same goes for the nuclear-free zone. And so long as Israel does not see the value of that for itself and for the region and for its place in the region, and for those, for the Arab countries that have relations with Israel now, be it the full political, be it the economic, what have you, I think it is very important to maintain the dialogue and to keep opening the doors towards that goal. And I cannot but, from a Palestinian perspective, stress enough that at the core of it all lies also the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship and ending this conflict, and ending the refugee problem, and creating the economic incentives, the political incentives for the entire region. So yes, I agree.
Yeah. And perhaps if I could turn to you, Dr. Al-Shahristani, please, for your remarks. There's 3 questions. I'm happy to repeat if it's helpful.
Well, to be very brief, because I realize we are running out of time for the first session, and there are some hands raised to comment or ask questions. Very briefly, it seems everybody who has spoken in this conference and elsewhere agrees of the importance, the imperative necessity of having or starting discussion on a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. So there is no point to keep on repeating how important it is. For such a conference to materialize, it's obvious without Israeli participation, the conference is not going to lead anywhere, simply because Israel is the only country that has nuclear weapons in the region. And without their participation in the meeting, of course, we will not have a region free of weapons of mass destruction. I think good arguments have been made why it is really in Israel's security interest to be part of such a discussion. I agree with Ambassador Wael that the Arab countries have not really done enough to convince the international community, particularly the US and the EU, to see the necessity and the importance of such a free zone. And they should really explore more such venues and see where it can lead to. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussain. I'm conscious of the time now, and thank you for reminding me. What I would suggest is we try and take a cluster of questions, and then I'll open the floor to all panelists. But we have a question from Ambassador Nabila on the threat of WMD could be minimized by adherence on the part of regional countries to major international arms control instruments like the CTBT. A list of such instruments could be drawn up and parties invited to adhere to them. So that's one question. It's more of a comment for panelists. Then we have another question asking whether panelists agree with the reason presented by Dr. Hussain Al-Shahristani, my apologies, but also I think this was raised by Nasser as well, as to why Israel has no reason to consider joining any proposal to join the WMD treaty in the Middle East. We also have a hand raised from the Russian mission, and I'd like to offer them the floor if you are able to join. Sir, I think it's Mr. Ustinov. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me and see me? Okay.
Yes, we can, sir. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Roman Ustinov. I'm working in the Russian mission in Vienna together with Ambassador Ulyanov, whom you probably all know. He's very engaged in the issues of WMD-free zone in the Middle East. And I was with him he was the head of the delegation of the Russian delegation at the second session of the UN conference on the WMD-free zone in the Middle East in New York late last year. And I would like to thank UNIDIR for all the events and the attention to the WMD-free zone issue, which we consider very important, and would like to thank the panelists for this regional perspective, which we also think is extremely important, since it's in the hands of the regional states, primarily the destiny of the WMD-free zone in the Middle East. We really think that the outcomes of the second session of the UN process are important, and we try to support it in our private conversations with the Israelis and in different forums publicly, including at the IAEA. And I just wanted to mention here that we think it is really good that the conference at the second session overcame this period of inaction during COVID pandemic and gathered momentum. We hope it will continue. But what is even more important, the results of the conference, the fact that the rules of procedure were agreed, and the fact that the consensus right now is the only way to take the decisions on all the issues, procedural and substantial, and even the very forward-looking outcome of the second session was to agree on the intersessional meetings, and as Tom Markram said, one has already taken place, which is good, and two more are ahead of us. What we try to publicly explain, and again privately to Israelis, is that there is nothing to lose in participating in the conference, since there is a decision that all decisions are taken by consensus. It virtually means that there is a veto right for any country on the issues discussed at the conference, and no decision is taken without consent of everybody. But while in the process, it gives all the countries of the region more leverages and more opportunities to influence the process itself, rather than to stay away without having any opportunity of influencing it, and just looking for countries that are inside, for regional neighbors, how they proceed with hopefully creating a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. Just one last point. We suggested, and it was this suggestion was made during the last session of the Board of Governors of the IEA here in Vienna. We again spoke in our continuous bilateral consultations with the Israelis. We suggested them to look closely into the documents that were adopted at the conference, and perhaps to consider the participation at the next session in the status of the observer, which would be a good start. To look how the process goes, what is discussed, and to decide further on the further status of participation. In any case, we hope that the participants of the conference would continue to build momentum, and to specifically in the intersessional period to go deeper into all the details of the future treaty on the WMD-free zone in the Middle East. We, as Russia, would continuously support the process and try to create the conditions and conducive atmosphere for it. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Okay. I hope panelists will forgive me, but I think Eran Lerman has raised his hand, and I'd like to offer you the floor, because we've also had a couple of comments on suggesting it's wrong to say that Israel is not prepared to talk about nuclear issues. So I'd like to allow Eran the floor, and then I'll go through it and allow each of the panelists to reply and wrap up before we close the meeting. Please, Eran, the floor is yours.
No, since I'm a panelist in the next session, I'm not going to steal my own thunder, but just to say, first of all, that I fully understand Hiba's sentiments. It reminded me of just speaking to my students about a book by Emil Habibi, Al-Mutasha'il, being both optimist and pessimist at the same time. I find myself in agreement with elements of the analysis put forward by Professor Hadian and by Karim in his own angle, but without leaving the main argument to the next session, I would please ask all of you to remember that it was not Israel which demolished the multilateral process in the mid-90s. In fact, we had something not very different from what Professor Dayan and Karim Haggag have been suggesting, namely a long corridor which begins with CBMs. And it was an Egyptian decision, not an Israeli decision, which destroyed not only ACUS, but the entire multilateral process. And there are people here who were there with us at the time, and which I remember fondly having our interactions with it. And so the history here has been put on its head. The argument also about whether Israel is a threat has also been put on its head, but let's leave that for another session.
Thank you, Eran. I'm going to close the questions now in order that we can finish on time, but I want to offer each of the panelists a couple of minutes, and if I could encourage you to be brief, and I'm sorry for deluging you with questions. There's a question on the idea of having a list of treaties and invitations to join, panelists' views on the Israeli incentives, and perhaps also responding to Iran's point previously. And then there was comments from the Russian mission on the second session of the conference and intersessional work there. But perhaps if I can start with you, Nasser, please, if you want to kick off, the floor's yours, sir.
Thank you very much. As I said, I'm coming from a realist school. And to me, laws, treaties, international norms, they're all important. I don't want to dismiss them, but by far is the reality on the ground, which is the power. Balance and imbalance of power. These are by far the most important phenomena for me. Just look at I was engaged in a talk with a group of people from the Middle East, which included Israelis for 8-9 years, talking about the missiles and also about the zone free of WMD. My understanding at the end of that 8-9 years was basically Israeli may agree to talk, restrain, and control on missile programs. Why? Because we have advanced missile programs. They have it, some others have it, so that would be fair, they think. And to participate in such a kind of a discussion and to constrain and control us. So that's very much realism. It find it in their interest. As I said, there are two ways that Israel may be convinced to join the process, to the negotiation, or in fact, even if they participate, I'm not all that enthusiastic about their participation in the process, because although they know that they have a veto power, there should be a consensus, as the Russian ambassador mentioned, but still they feel that they will be singled out. We had a discussion about that particular issue. They think they will be singled out. There's going to be some political pressure. Why the hell? Why they have to participate? So it's easier, more convenient to not participate. There is not going to be pressure on them. Why don't you participate in this process? So I would like to say the two things again. Number one, if another country has the weapon, like the missile program which we have, they are ready to engage us in the reduction or in the constraint or control of the missile limitation. Number two is, this is conditional. We in the Middle East offer them a comprehensive package of economic cooperation, diplomatic recognition, and security guarantees. They may be able to then to agree with some sort of a limitation, some sort of a transparency, some sort of a inspections of the program. Thank you.
If I could now turn to you, Hiba, if I could invite you all to provide some quite quick closing remarks, because I'm really sorry to say, but I actually have to run off very shortly. But Hiba, please.
We're short on time. I think I said my remarks, so I pass it on to somebody else, other than saying thank you for this wonderful opportunity. And I'm glad we're having this discussion. I think it's important to continue the dialogue on all levels.
Thank you, Hiba. If I can now turn to you, Karim, perhaps for quick closing remarks.
So thank you. Very quickly, I very much welcome the suggestion by Ambassador Al-Mullah regarding commitments, political commitments to adhere to the multilateral treaty regimes. As I think that in and of itself would be a very important confidence building measure that the region should think about. And Egypt has actually proposed such a measure, that there would be political declarations by countries of the region announcing their commitment to adhere to these instruments to be deposited with the UN Security, with the UN Secretariat. Israel has no incentive as such as of now to join the process. But however, I think the process itself should move forward, right? So Israel should not have a veto on the very substantive discussions that are, in fact, moving forward in New York. And I think our Russian colleague, I think, really emphasized the importance of the process and how that process is actually gaining traction. Again, this will be a long, drawn-out process. And so at the very least, the process should move forward, even at this stage, if Israel decides not to join that process. There are many myths about Acres. Acres has now a long history and a long historiography, right? And one of those myths is that the process failed over differences on the nuclear issue. That is certainly correct, right? But it's not the full story. People forget that it wasn't just the nuclear issue that was a subject of contention. It was the reality that Israel did not want to engage on any arms control process with respect to any class of weapons, conventional or unconventional, right? So the first two letters of the Acres process seem to be missing from Israel's calculus. Israel did not want to engage in any arms control process. And that really brings us to the crux of the issue. And I will close on this point, right? The decision before Israel, again, I don't think should be one of whether it decides to give up its nuclear weapons or not. I think the decision before Israel is whether it decides to join a process that can avert a potential nuclearization of the Middle East, or choose to remain outside of that process and therefore be faced with what I think is a very different security reality with the nuclearization of the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. And if I could turn to you, Hussain, for the final word, please. The floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, very briefly, this has been a very useful discussion. My uptake of what we have been discussing is that all countries in the region, particularly those who are trying to normalize relationship with Israel and have good relationships with the US, should exert more efforts on the states in particular to pressure Israel to join the process. As it has been explained, joining the process is not the reaching a final agreement yet on the final treaty. And the other thing is, short of this, if for any reason it would not be convened, the regional powers, countries, particularly the Gulf states with Iran, should really engage in dialogue to try to de-escalate the situation as much as possible, because this will help also eventually to convene such a conference on a free zone. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd echo your point on this being a useful discussion, and I really apologize to all panelists for hurrying you, not least given the collegiate and the constructive nature of discussion. And really a big thank you from me for the discussion. It's been really insightful and greatly appreciated from all of you. So thank you. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Chen, and the floor is yours. And wishing you success for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. Also, I want to thank to all our first session panelists for a very rich and honest discussion. As you know or not, my name is Chen, and I am the Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone Project Lead. With that, the session will discuss the possible pathways as well as what could be the contours of the negotiation process and the subsequent elements of a Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone Treaty. As expressed by some of the authors, there is still a need for conceptual clarity and a roadmap on key issues related to the zone, such as scope, prohibitions, verification, and implementation, as well as what really states can expect from a Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone negotiation and resulting treaty, and that this clarity will be crucial for securing and sustaining the engagement of states in the region and increase really chance for progress. I know many people did not manage to ask their questions in the previous session, and I apologize for that. I will take some questions that were not asked and incorporate them in this session today or now. Joining me today also to discuss these questions that I just raised are Dr. Arslan Chikhaoui, the Executive Chairman of the Consultancy and Studies Center in Algeria. He's a member of the World Economic Forum, Experts Council, Defense and Security Forum Advisory Board, and UN Security Council Resolution 1540 Civil Society Forum. He is visiting lecturer at both Algerian State Staff Academy and Algerian Civil Defense Academy. Dr. Chikhaoui holds degrees in international relations and economics from the University of Berkeley and in biology from Algiers University of Science and Technology. Colonel retired Dr. Eran Lerman is the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and Editor-in-Chief of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. He's a former Deputy for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the Israel National Security Council. Between 2001 and 2009, he served as Assistant for Analysis to the Deputy Director for Intelligence Production at the Israel Defense Forces Directorate of the Military Intelligence. Dr. Lerman is currently a lecturer at Shalem College. He holds a PhD in history from London School of Economics and a Master of Public Administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Not last, but definitely not least, Ambassador Najla AlQassimi is the Director of Global Affairs Department and Public Policy Center. In 2008, Ambassador AlQassimi became one of the two first women in the UAE history to be appointed as Ambassador Extraordinary and Planetary. She has served as UAE Ambassador to Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Portugal. Sheikha Najla has also worked in Syed University as instructor in the International Affairs Department. And Sheikha Najla has a degree in political science from the United Arab Emirates University and a master's degree in e-government from Stockholm University. We are very honored to have all the three of you with us. We will be taking questions as we did before through the Q&A functions, or participant can raise their hand if they wish to take the floor. You will be able to turn on your cameras and microphone as we did before all our participants during the Q&A. So the first question I would like to pose to our panelists really address is, what are the main pathways for addressing nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons threats in the region? One options that were mentioned in the essays as well as in the discussion previously by Ambassador Al-Mula was adherence to the three existing regimes, namely the NPT, CWC, and the BWC. Another option that was discussed some in your essays as well was building on this regime and filling really the gaps. So Eran, let me ask you first. I will start with you. Your essay spoke about concerns around compliance and enforcement that exist in existing weapon of mass destruction instrument. Could you elaborate a little bit on this and give us some of your opinion on how the zone could or should address these concerns?
Well, as you know, I'm a skeptic as to the feasibility at this stage of history, not in the abstract sense, but where we are and under the conditions in which we live, of actually reaching a treaty at this stage. And one of the reasons is that in our region, there have been already 4 blatant cases of breaches of existing instruments. So clearly, from an Israeli perspective, the utility of adherence is only valuable if there are other enforcement mechanisms or mechanisms for deterrence, because we are talking about 4 countries signatories to the NPT who all had an active nuclear weapon program. Iran still has one, and all pretenses otherwise, I think, are fairly absurd given the nature of their program. Iraq certainly had a nuclear weapon program until it was stopped in its tracks back in 91. We continued to have maybe false suspicions that it persisted until 2003, but it was certainly there in 91. While Iraq was a signatory. Syria had a nuclear weapon program that was stopped by Israeli action in 2007. And Libya had one until they came to the conclusion after the American intervention in Iraq that the risks involved were too high. And so the combination of coercive potential and intelligent diplomacy, as Bill Burns describes it in his memoirs, convinced Gaddafi to disarm. But we have a history of non-compliance, so which is very vivid in our minds. So we have, I think, some reason to be skeptical. Moreover, if we go, for example, to the CWC, Syrian compliance with the UN Security Council Resolution 2118 is still tainted, and there have been incidents of usage by Syria of chemical weapons after their full commitment and internationally monitored disarmament following the events of 2013, which led, as you may all recall, to a one-time attack by the US under the Trump administration. And so, and by the way, I was really, I can definitely understand Professor Hadian's earlier comments about Iran having been targeted by Saddam Hussein. And Professor Shahristani has reminded us of Halabja, which shocked all of us, and in fact, I think has been the direct reason for the creation of the CWC as we know it now, and then of the OPCW as we know it now. But Iran has been the firm and unflinching ally of the regime that has been using chemical weapons against its citizens, not that far from our border. So I think we are entitled to our doubts on this particular aspect of the discussion.
Thank you, Eran. With that, let me move to you, Najla. And in your essay, you emphasized that the UAE has made it a priority to join all relevant international weapon of mass destruction instrument in order to enable it to enjoy all the benefits of peaceful uses. What other elements will the UAE want a Middle East weapon of mass destruction free zone to include to further really economic and development goals?
Thank you, Chen, for hosting us. And regarding the UAE perspective, the CPRN, is that initially the position of the Emirates is to allow the region to benefit from the scientific development and economic and technological possibilities, which can be developed through the advancement in these technologies. The issue here now is that until today, we don't have the possibilities to look an eye to eye with our neighbors, which create the challenges that we are facing. To start with, United Arab Emirates, as you mentioned, gave up all its even which are stipulated in the NPT, that UAE was allowed to proliferate to have the process of developing its own nuclear fuel. But it gave up that right under the 123 agreement with the United States to encourage on specifically focusing on the economic and scientific development of the use of nuclear weapon. The idea of nuclear free zone in the Middle East was a priority for the United Arab Emirates. But as we heard from the previous panel, when we, yes, I do agree that probably Israel doesn't have the incentive to get out of the, or at least to address the issue of developing a nuclear weapon. But is the solution is that Iran have also a nuclear weapon or the capability of developing its nuclear weapon, and that perspective, who will counter Iran on the other side? Are we going to see Saudi Arabia will demanding for a nuclear weapon as well? This is exactly what discredit the essence or the essential idea of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. If we are going to take it on that direction. There is, I do agree with the previous speakers that we have to have incentive for Israel to at least participate on the negotiation in the future, or at least to address this matter as part of the Middle East region. But I don't see that countering this by another nuclear country is going to be the right solution in that direction. Which brings me to the idea of regional cooperation, or at least establishing regional dialogue in order to address this subject under the umbrella of regional cooperation, regional partnership, or under the umbrella of the international community, to establish at least some kind of accountability for the discussion. So I will leave it to that for the next two questions.
Thank you, Najla. And I think you're raising several issues that we will continue to discuss in this session. Arslan, before I turn to you, I want to introduce yet another topic that was featured both in your essays as well as essay by several other authors. The issue of how should some of the security concerns you and other authors mentioned in your essay should be addressed, including, for example, delivery systems and the threat from non-state actors that you especially highlighted. What exactly also will be the role of outside players, as was discussed in the previous session? So Arslan, yours to speak about the dangers of weapon of mass destruction used by terrorists. Do you think this is an element that should or could be included in the zone? And if so, how we think we should address that?
Thank you, Khan. Hello, everybody. Hello, friends and colleagues. I'm sorry I was late because I was in a meeting. So yes, I fully agree that the question of non-state actors / terrorism should be included in any regimes or agreements. Why? Because it is still a real threat in the region. When I'm talking about the region, I'm talking about the Middle East, North Africa, but also extended to the Sahel. The Sahel is really the space where could be developed CBRN weapons, or could be used CBRN weapons by the non-state actors or terrorists. So Algeria is trying to push this and to defend this, and also to try to push in a way to create a coordination, a regional or international coordination, in order to face or to combat this kind of threats. But also before combating or before facing this threat, Algeria is trying also to prevent to prevent this kind of threats and CBRN using by or used by non-state actors in the region. And how I see that is that just to include in the agreements, multilateral agreements or bilateral agreements, the fact that that non-state actors are really or they have still intentions to use the nuclear or weapon of mass destruction. So in this case, two or three things. One is building capacity building in order to face this. Second is to consolidate the regimes or the agreements that are already implemented with this issue, which is the non-state actors. And third is what is required is a real cooperation or coordination, internationally speaking, or within the region, to face this kind of threats.
Thank you, Arslan. And as you mentioned, Algeria has been a leading, and the Sahel in general, North Africa has been leading in that aspect. And the question is, can we expand that? And can we incorporate within the zone, either within the zone or as a parallel process? Najla, you also mentioned in your essays that the UAE places a priority on growing its CRBN detection and mitigation related technologies. How do you assess the threat from non-state actors on critical infrastructure related to these industries? And should, or if so, how can those be addressed within the zone?
Yes, actually, it is very important for us in the region, especially after the recent development with the Yemen issue. And for example, before 2015, or before the beginning of the war in Yemen didn't have a cruise missile, for example. How does the Houthi manage to have such a technology in this period? This is a very important question, and the international community has to address it and put the current situation into its perspective, instead of trying to dilute the grave problem of having non-state actors have the possibility to acquire such weapons in very short time. There are some initiatives, like, for example, I think, but it's not fully internationalized, like the Hague Code of Conduct against the ballistic missile, which is still, I think, need for further discussion around how the world can address such an issue. The problem still regarding such an initiative is that it addresses a certain area and it doesn't speak, for example, about non-state actors holding such possibilities at the current stage. Also, it is still not considered as part of the international, it doesn't have the international umbrella. It's still mostly European with some agreement from certain countries. So I think there is an important need for the development of such instrument and see how it will address not just the European concerns, but also other parts of the world. Also, regarding the non-state actors is also the new type of, like, for example, the drones. which is also another area that can be addressed. I don't know, until now it's still, for example, the Houthis, they managed to get hold of the drones, but how did they manage to have it travel all this way to its target without having capability of satellite, for example, direction, or kind of how did they manage to monitor it to reach its target from Yemen? These are questions that need the international community needs to address it in that matter.
Thank you, Najla. And I think you're raising an important issue here, especially given the fact that, and what Arslan was saying, is that there are many concerns related to security in the region. Some of them are related directly to weapons of mass destruction. Some of them are related in a secondary way. And the question, can the zone encompass all of them, or do we want to see some complementary measures that really will support the establishment of the zone, but also address some other security related issues? Eran, in your essay, you argued that a different process is required, first to address regional security concerns more broadly. Could you elaborate really on what the structure that you envision or the aim of such a process and could be, and whether regional cooperation with CBMs will play a role in its success?
Well, what we are already seeing, and we are seeing it develop right in front of our eyes, is the emergence of a community of like-minded players in the region. And what we saw in the Negev foreign ministers, well, they call it summit. Summit is normally reserved for the heads of state. So a conference of foreign ministers is a phenomenal indication, actually, not so much creating a new situation, but reflecting a new situation in which indeed security is part, security cooperation and security understandings are becoming part of the equation. We've traveled a long way, I believe, from the days in which the Egyptian foreign ministry and Abu Musa deliberately undermined both the multilateral process and normalization in general, and the picture we saw just yesterday of Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry with his hands in the hands of his colleagues from 3 other Arab countries, as well as Blinken and Foreign Minister Lapid. This is a different world we live in. And yes, I think it lays the foundations for a different path forward. But like-mindedness is a necessity here, because the region has been torn apart by ideological orientations. We have, of course, as Arslan very rightly and justifiably pointed out, we have enemies who are non-state actors. We are feeling it on a daily basis in Israel in the last few days. Dawash, as they say in Arabic, elements, adherents of the ideology and conceptual framework of Dawla al-Islamiyya. We have Ikhwani or brotherhood orientations of some elements in our neighborhood. We've had, of course, and we have, of course, the ideological orientation of the Iranian Revolution, which basically puts it on the other side of the divide. I was very gratified to hear Professor Hadayan speaking about Israel to be offered regional cooperation, full recognition in economic relations. The country of Iran as a nation probably would easily and happily accept all this. But the current leadership under Khamenei and Raisi is committed to our destruction, would not in any borders, regardless of what solution may be found between us and the Palestinians. And that, of course, precludes security cooperation of any kind, or building confidence building measures of any kind, as long as this is the explicit position. So that actually is the determinant here. And quite frankly, if I deconstruct the two options that were put here, either that Iran goes nuclear to coerce Israel or Iran embraces Israel. We all know that the second is not on the table. It is not, it is sacrilege in the eyes of the current Iranian leadership. So we are back to the first. And if that is the situation, then we need, first of all, I would say a security community of the like-minded players in the region, and I say the region writ large, because I believe that also the Eastern Mediterranean and the Mediterranean as a whole should be looked upon as part of such a community.
Thank you, Eran. And while I completely take what you're saying, I want to actually commend Nasser for expressing such an idea in such a public forum, that taking into account a different position that, or calling for a different position to promote really more regional security. But related to that and what you just said, let me ask one last question. I will encourage our participants to start populating our Q&A or raise their hands before I'm turning to them. But with that, I want to ask a last question for all our panelists. So in the first session, it was claimed that there is a need for more incentive, both positive as well as negative, to move the process forward. Some of the positive were mentioned as economic cooperation, political recognition, and some of the negatives were mentioned were sanctions or UN Security Council involvement or the P5 involvement. So with that, I would like to really open for discussion. And the question, what is or should be the role of external parties and existing international institutions, including in providing security assurances or ensuring compliance and enforcement, if you look on some of the existing organization. I will start with you, Najla. In your essay, you made a strong case for the need for international sponsorship of the process during the negotiation, as well as in the implementation of the zone. Could you tell us a little bit why this will be an important component for the zone?
I think the international community is very important in this component for several reasons. First of all, the accountability of any agreement reached in the region. Still, I mean, even that we have some kind of like-minded groups that gather around certain ideas, but still some others who are not part of these groups. So a general umbrella is needed to foster such a discussion. Second thing is that the international community has the possibility to monitor and to establish the transparency of any future development or agreement in that regard, and create the measurement of regarding the compliance of any agreement reached by the partner. Of course, it is very important that the solution comes from the region itself. Otherwise, it will be difficult to be implemented. But the process of taking it further and implement this agreement, it will be very helpful to see the international community involved in that matter.
Thank you, Najla. And from Arslan and Eran nodding their head, I think they agree to at least most of the things you have been just mentioned. Eran, if you want to answer on that.
Well,
and
very quickly, being an ACRES veteran, I remember with gratitude the contributions of mentors such as the Canadians and others working on specific CBMs. And therefore, I agree that there should be, and there could be a contribution. But the moment we start going into a coercive concept, the kind of things, that ideas that while being so desperate to move forward has been playing with some kind of international coercion, frankly, there's a reason why the Egyptian attempts again and again to bring the INC to a vote at the IAEA plenaries in the early part of the previous decade failed with ever-growing margins. Very rare for Israel to actually win a vote in an international forum, but these actually were won, and for a reason, because practically all relevant players understood that a coercive concept here is irrelevant. And with all due respect to our former gavel holders, the likelihood that we're going to see an effective American-Russian partnership in sponsoring a regional process now, given that at least one of the two has just brandished its nuclear gun in order to scare away people who may disturb it while it was robbing its neighbor, I doubt if this is going to be a very useful, let's say, point of departure. So let's, as Najla said, let's stick to the region speaking, the regional players speaking with each other.
Arslan, you want to comment on that aspect as well?
Yes, just one or 2 points to add to what it has been said is trying to avoid the double standards in terms of measurements. I mean, double standards in our view, I mean, in the Algerian view, means that there is a discourse regarding some countries, and there is another discourse regarding another country, and this is very important if we can push that. But I fully agree that the solution has to come from the region, and not to let other key players or international key players to be involved in this, and let countries at least to develop the capacities, the nuclear or chemical capacities for civilian purposes or for scientific purposes, as Dr. Najla said.
Thank you, Arslan. Actually, if I can continue with that thought and with your comments, what are the opportunities that you see for cooperation with regional organizations, for example, with the Plindaba Treaty that cover about half of the countries that will be part of the Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone, or the AFCON, that is the operational body of Plindaba, in Africa, or other instruments. For example, you're party to the UN Security Council 1540 UN Council Resolution Civilian Forum. So other ideas that we can incorporate within the zone, or as a parallel processes that could enhance security concerns by regional countries.
I think my view is to use the platforms or the platforms that already exist. To not double and put in parallel other regional platforms. As you already know, I mean, Algeria is deeply involved with the African Union, and is deeply involved in promoting a free zone, a mass destruction free zone within the region, within Africa, and within. But using the platforms that already exist, like 5+5 in the Mediterranean, or all the platforms that exist, is more, I think, from my perspective, is more useful than to create a new one and then to reinitiate new processes and all this stuff. One key thing is also, I'm always trying to defend this idea, is the diplomacy, but the scientific diplomacy to raise awareness. Again, how to raise awareness among the region and among the players is also to try to find a link between politics and between the politics and the scientific, with this scientific or science diplomacy. This could very much help, and how to try to push these platforms to integrate the scientific within the discussion and the dialogue, in order to let them to understand what is, I mean, raise awareness.
Thank you. Eran, let me conclude with the question to you. It is expected that the nuclear weapon-free states will be required to provide security assurances to states that join the weapon of mass destruction-free zone. As is the case in every other zone that established, which security assurances do you think will be most important?
Well, quite frankly, given our unique history, who we are, where we came from, what we've learned in terms of the mechanisms of deterrence and decision, even what we've seen just now in front of our eyes in the last few weeks, I doubt that any security guarantee, any security assurance in itself would substitute for as far as Israel is concerned, for the centrality of our deterrent posture, ambiguous deterrent posture, until the day comes when the dynamics of the region itself, not an external guarantee of sorts, will be reassuring enough for us to understand that the world has changed so much that we can look at our security equations in a different way. I'm being very careful here because I don't want to rule out any such possibility in the fullness of time. I'm just saying that the region, the attitudes of key players in the region, the drivers behind some of the conflicts that continue to lead some players in the region to seek our physical destruction as a state. When all of this changes, the question of international assurances would be less relevant.
Thank you, Eran. I think there is several questions from that I monitored in the Q&A, but also I want to bring some of the questions that were tried to be asked before and did not. So if anyone wants to ask their question again, please raise your hand and I will call upon you. There is a question, Eran, to you by Esra Serim. I'd like to ask Mr. Lerman, what will Israel participate to the talks over the weapon of mass destruction for the Middle East if the JCPOA is restored in Vienna? I guess the question is, will Israel calculation will change with the restoration of the JCPOA to tilt it towards participation in the zone negotiation? And do you think that Israel has been trying to find a common ground with the other countries in the region?
Well, we are seeking common ground with the like-minded players in the region, and this is, and here our posture, our deterrent posture, and our willingness to take action are actually part of our reputational gain, not loss, in the equation of the present situation. As for the JCPOA, I think all who came to Sde Boker, except perhaps for Secretary of State Blinken, were deeply convinced that it would have very severe consequences, particularly if it is attended by the delisting of the IRGC as a terrorist organization, given what our friends in the Gulf have just been subjected to, given what we know about this organization, given what the region has been going through. So it is our view that the JCPOA, to begin with, was a very problematic document, that a return to it will barely create a space of 2 or 3 years before Iran is at the military nuclear threshold, and that to engage in negotiations with that kind of a gun to our head is exactly what we're not going to do.
Thank you, Eran. Karim, you have a comment or a question to our panelists?
Thank you, Chen, and thank you to all the panelists for their very insightful comments. Yeah, I have a comment I would like to direct to Iran, because I find myself in agreement when he mentioned all of the problems with compliance in the region. And certainly, the Middle East has had very flagrant examples of non-compliance with existing treaty commitments. But I think the problem is with his inference that this is a problem for which there is no solution, right? And it's as if it seems to be dismissive of the entire practice and legacy of arms control in addressing problems of verification and compliance. Now, that legacy is certainly not perfect, but I think it's very conceptually problematic when, if I understood his inference, is that arms control is irrelevant to this process. And then, of course, the second part of his comment was that the answer to this problem is deterrence. And I think conceptually, that also presents a problem, because if the answer is deterrence, what happens when other states in the region actually take up the recourse to deterrence to address this growing challenge of proliferation and compliance? And will not that be a prescription for WMD proliferation in the region? Thank you.
Eran, you want to answer?
Yeah. First of all, I am not saying that arms control is irrelevant here. But when we engaged in ACAS to begin with, we understood more or less what we were getting ourselves into. However, in the eyes of the key other player, namely, the story of ACAS is a story about Israel and Egypt. Israel won the consent of many other Arab participants to a scheme of things that's focused on CBMs. Not very different from what both Professor Hadian and Karim himself and Hiba in their own way suggested as a let's say, the beginning of a corridor. But we found ourselves being under an attempt to forcibly drag us to the end of the corridor right from the beginning. In other words, not an open-ended process, but a predetermined one. And and moreover, this was not an arms control exercise, it was an exercise in disarmament. This was a first committee conceptual framework, not an arms control framework, which we are familiar with in the context of actual arms control negotiations between other nations. Disarmament and arms control are not synonymous. And as to what may happen if other nations take up, well, interestingly enough, there's only one country in the region now which is actively pursuing a strategy of building its own capacity, and it is not because of Israel. Israel is the, let's say, the excuse and the obvious let's say, argument, but ultimately we are talking about regional hegemony and an agenda driven by ideology. This is not raison d'etat, this is raison de révolution, this is an ideological imperative, and that, of course, colors the entire way we look at the situation. It is for that reason that we have our own doctrine in this respect, based on our capabilities and our intelligence work and all that this entails. But leaving it aside, it is not because of Israel that the international community, the Security Council in total, with 13-2 basically, came to see the Iranian nuclear project as a threat to international stability. This is not because everyone in the UN Security Council is working for Israel, not China, not Russia, and not the others who voted at the time on Resolution 1929. There are much broader reasons for that, and this is why we cannot look at this as an equivalence. I was once asked about this difference by a friend, and my answer was that back in 1939, there were factories building Messerschmitts and there were factories building Spitfires. They were not morally equivalent.
Thank you, Eran. Najla and Arslan, before I'm bringing Nasser into the conversation, which I'm sure will be a trilateral, Israeli, Egyptian, and Iranian one, Najla and Arslan, do you want to comment on any of the issues that were raised in the last couple of minutes?
Not really, actually. I'm not sure if I have anything to add to that point. But actually, I'm interested to listen to Mr. Hadian, what he will say.
Thank you. Arslan?
So
I want just to add maybe one or two things in order to regarding the platforms that we have already talked about is and what is missing maybe within this this ability to promote the free zone is this cross link or this link between the scientific community, the political community, and the intelligence community, because mostly if we want to combat the combat the non-state actors is to have this exchange of information and exchange of experience between the three communities to promote that.
Thank you. Thank you for idea of how to move forward in a constructive way. Nasser, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Although I did not want to engage in the type of a discussion which I'm going to, and I'll try to be very brief on those points and basically state the points which I think are far more important. First of all, regarding the JCPOA, I would like, that's interesting to know that the most radical elements of our polity have the same view as Netanyahu and the most hawkish politician of Israel. None of them wants the JCPOA for their own reasons. But what I bring to attention of both of these forces is, what is the alternative? If you think the alternative, the plan B, so-called plan Bs, are going to serve you, so that's why I think the rational individual, they do want the JCPOA. I have the privilege of knowing about the content, and I've been critical, but at the end, I would support the JCPOA because I think that's a great deal for America. That's a great, great, great deal for America. But at the end of the day, even I said, when I was asked, would you support the JCPOA? I said, yes. I said, you're so critical, why you support it? Because I said that in the system of my strategic calculus, our whole nuclear program just played this much, a little bit. That's why I would support the JCPOA, regardless of my criticism. But I would like to ask, what is the alternative to the JCPOA? I laid out a very detailed scenario, which the end result would be a regional war, which Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE are going to suffer the most. That would be naive if Israeli politicians, Israeli strategists think that, okay, it is going to be a US-Iran war. That's very naive. As soon as our file, because our file cannot go, they would begin with the Board of Governors of the IAEA and then go to the Security Council, but then it's going to be vetoed by the Russians. Thus, they're going to go back to the JCPOA, Brits or French or others are going to initiate the snapback process. Then they are going to bring back the sanction. As soon as that happens, not only we are going to withdraw from the JCPOA and our commitments under that, we are going rather to withdraw from the NPT. Then what would happen? America should credibilize its threat. It should bring a number of these aircraft carriers to the region to prove that, okay, you know, we are serious and you are going to suffer a military attack. As soon as it happens, we are going to rearrange our military posture in the region. We know that they cannot deter America.
but certainly they can deter Israelis. They have enough resources because Israelis are in a disadvantaged position, no matter what they say regarding Iran. We are just right around themselves. They have to fly 1,000 kilometers in order to reach our border or significant places. How many sorties they can have? But we have tried that in Lebanon and Syria. So they know that they are in a disadvantaged position. And we have been able to create a, what I call deterrence belt that would deter them. And that's why Israel is attacking us constantly in Syria. They don't want to see the completion of that deterrence belt. And that's why Iran, in fact, is quiet. So the alternative is very bad. To me, any serious strategist in Israel would encourage the Americans to go for the JCPOA and would support the JCPOA. Because without the JCPOA, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, they're all going to suffer from the results and a lot of unknown consequences. That's one point about the JCPOA. Sorry, I mean, I need a couple of more minutes. That's interesting to see. Eran is talking about, you know, Security Council 13 voted to 2. But I guess he forgets that normally we have almost every country in the General Assembly condemned Israel for different issues, except Israel, America, Micronesia, and another country. So let's be a little bit realistic. Neither you are popular, neither we are popular. And talking about those issues in a way that, you know, we have a better moral ground, I guess doesn't have a realistic base. So my point now to our friends in the region, we have to come to the realization that Israeli exceptionalism is going to remain with us for the foreseeable future. There are exceptions to almost every norms and rules. They can afford it. If we could, we would have done the same thing. Let's be frank. They can afford to be exception to everything. So they are, and I'm not blaming them for that exceptionalism, but we have to live with it for the foreseeable future. In our calculus, we have to have that in mind that this is the case. Number two is they have far more resources than all of us combined in international media. They can shape, they can influence the narratives, the dominant narratives. No matter if they have the Al Jazeera now or a few others, it is not just comparable. It's not just comparable with the resources.
Nasser, if I didn't know you wouldn't be guilty of anything of the sort, I would have called this an anti-Semitic trope.
Why? Why you should be upset? Why you should be upset about
the accusation that we control the New York Times is
who said control?
Is ridiculous.
Did I ever use the control? I said you have the influence. I said you have.
Okay, enough. I'm not.
Let Nasser
any further.
I never said the control because you know that I've lived enough in the West to know that's not imaginable. But you have the influence. But for your narrative, because of whatever reason, would become the dominant narrative. And it is not about the Jews. It's about Israel. And that's not good to invoke this anti-Semitism to someone like me. On the public. Yeah, you know, everyone knows.
I would not suspect you of it, but coming from other people, I would have said this is a.
Ran, if you can keep your comments, I will let you enter.
Okay.
I will finish my
talk. If you can wrap up, because we will have to finish.
That's 1 minute. So that out of the two options which I mentioned, but another country, I never said Iran should have that one. Any other country, Egypt, Turkey, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, whatever. If they have the nuclear weapons, then you're going to come and sit and negotiate. It shouldn't be Iran. And it is not going to be Iran. As I said, that I have provided 14 reasons why we don't want the weapons. I want the capability, but not the weapons. And the package which I supposed, you can help that process by coming and saying that, okay, if these 5 countries, up till now, I did not recommend anything. It was not a prescription, but this is a prescription. If Israelis come and say, if country A, B, C, D, E, F do this thing, diplomatically recognize me, economically cooperate with me, and agrees with the security pact, I'm ready to get rid of my nuclear weapons. That can be helpful. And propaganda-wise, that would be good propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser. I will let each of our speakers refer or address if they want to address anything that Nasser said or Karim said before, and then also add any concluding remarks that you might have for the entire panel. I will also pose to you something that Nasser said before in the previous session and mentioned just right now, is that Iran does not want the nuclear weapons, but wants the capabilities. This will be a challenge, or could be a challenge both to the NPT as well as the zone if established, given the fact that hedging is not something that is not allowed under the NPT or under existing zones. So I will pose you that question of how regional state might want, or will they feel threatened by that? And if they will, how they think to address that within the zone or within another context. So with that, answer Nasser questions or remarks if you would like, try to answer my questions as well as giving your own remarks. And I will start with you, Najla.
Regarding the JCPOA, as Nasser mentioned it, I will say the exact argument that he gave Iran. What is the incentive if they reached an agreement with the international community regarding the nuclear program in Iran? What is the incentive for Iran to address the other issues that we in the region have concern about it, given the delivery system, which is ongoing developing program that Iran is developing, the support of the non-state actors and the maritime security. What is the incentive here if they reached an agreement without addressing these issues of concern? To close my remark, yes, probably in the paper I submitted, it was most of optimistic paper, as I say, and giving the different perspective to the matter. But since I submitted that paper until today, there has been many changes and many developments in the world, which make us rethink about the current situation, especially the development in the JCPOA, where some of our like-minded group in the region that have concern that are we going to face a pressure from United States to sign 1, 2, 3 agreement similar to the United Arab Emirates if we are going to develop our program or not. That wasn't a compulsory by the NPT. But United Arab Emirates decided to take that step in order to emphasize that the first step into developing a free zone, Middle East free zone of mass destruction weapons, we have to take an exemplary step. But nowadays, thinking back, forward, are we going to take the same step if we knew the development and the current situation. I don't know. Still, this is a question to come on in the future when we see the final resolution of the discussion around this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. I see, sorry, and I missed a question, so I will bring one of the participants to ask the question before I turn to you, Arslan, and Eran, and Najla, if you will be interested to answer that question, I will obviously give you the floor again. So we have a participant from the Egyptian mission in New York. You should be able to unmute yourself, Mr. Al-Masani.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the chance to have just very quickly, very few comments. I am Mohammed Al-Masani. I am counselor at the Egyptian mission in New York. I would like to have very few comments about this session, and maybe only just one comment from previous session. But at the beginning, let me emphasize in general. As I heard from one of the panelists, Egypt has never put any restrictions on any kind of normalization on any relation between Israel and the countries in the Middle East. Actually, this is a sovereign decision for each country. However, our minister, and as he stated very clearly during the press conference in Najaf, for Egypt, it's very clear that to achieve a real peace in the region, we have to settle the Palestinian question according to the two-state solutions. So this is very clearly our own position. We haven't changed our own position. This is what we say from the beginning. Regarding the conference and regarding, I heard also some panelists, they mentioned, or you discussed the issue of incentives. Actually, the Middle East conference, let us be realistic. The Arab group decided to submit the decision to the General Assembly and establish the new or begins the new process within the UN, simply because we didn't witness any development to implement the 1995 resolution. So the Arab group decided to submit the decision to the General Assembly to start this process. And this process actually is a clear implementation to the 1995 resolution. And it allows, as it was mentioned also previously, it allows member states to take decisions by consensus and free will of all member states. So it's, I don't know a reason for any country, including Israel, not to join us. We approved, we adopted during the last session the rules of procedure, and it was very clear about the consensus-based decision making in this regard. In terms of incentives as I heard, as you discussed, presenting incentives for Israel to allow Israel to join the free zone or the conference. Actually, I'm not sure if the incentives should come at the beginning or before we start the process, or after we join all of us the process and start to take serious steps to establish the free zone, and then later on all of us will enjoy the positive developments from such process. Because simply when you mentioned what the international community should do, in my opinion, the international community is obliged by the 1995 resolution to establish the free zone in the Middle East. So this is an obligation upon the international community because the 1995 resolution is simply part of the deal to extend the NPT indefinitely. So I cannot imagine the international community, we ask the international community to please try to play a role. This is a commitment, in fact, on the international community in this regard. And regarding the CPMs, actually, the conference is, as we mentioned also previously, since session 1 of the Middle East Conference, the conference offers a suitable platform for offering confidence building measures on discussing all the security concerns for all the region or for all the member states of the region. So it's the conference is a good platform to go ahead and start discussing or raising all your concerns in this regard. And that's why this is another point I think it's in the best interest of everyone, including Israel, to participate in the conference. And let us be realistic, at least we have 4 of the P5 are participating in the conference, which shows that how the process is gaining momentum and credibility between the member states. I'm sorry for taking too much time, but my last comment is regarding my 2 last comments regarding the, as it was mentioned, that Egypt present resolutions to IEA that one way or another is condemning or criticizing Israel. Actually, we are not trying to condemn or criticize anyone. We are just trying to reflect the consensus between the member states of the international community, either in the IEA or the General Assembly. This is what we are trying to do. And this has been explicitly very clear year after year. And I can tell you that last year we had more votes in the General Assembly regarding the establishment of the free zone compared to the previous year. So this is the international community consensus or will regarding the issue of the establishment of the free zone. It's not trying to, we are not trying to condemn or trying to criticize anyone. Absolutely, we are trying to invite everyone to join us in this process. And let me to conclude the last point. If we are trying to really build confidence measures in the region, the best way, I fully understand that confidence building measures can be helpful in this process. But if we want to really have peace in the region, the only way is to have nuclear disarmament and to establish the free zone in the region. This is the best way to build confidence between member states of the region. But any other way or trying to avoid this goal or postpone it after achieving a long process, which no one knows when it will come, I don't think this is the best way to proceed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I apologize for interfering with our concluding remarks. I did not see it before. And so with that, Eran, I will let you continue with the concluding remarks and answer any questions that you might want to have.
Well, very clearly, I have been a participant. I speak for myself, not for my government, which has its own imperatives and concerns. I have been a participant in ACAS. I know that Israel did engage in Glion. The prerequisite for successful engagement is for any such process to be constructed as an open-ended proposition, not as a coercive mechanism. And for an ultimate successful outcome down the road, what can I say? We would need somebody with the clarity and open-minded attitude that I've heard from Professor Hadian as the Rahabar in Iran, rather than the present crowd who are committed to our destruction, which colors everything we do. And therefore, we were hoping for a longer and stronger proposition than the JCPOA, which the American administration was at least hoping to achieve. And that's all I can say at this point.
Thank you, Eran. Arslan, before you give in your concluding remark, I would just want to emphasize one comment that were made by Ambassador Al-Mula, which I think many of you know very well, that the shortcoming of the International Instrument of Arms Control can be also incentive to improve on such instruments, like the former Testament Treaty or shortcoming of the JCPOA really create a vibrant discussion and follow-up on delivery systems. So there is also opportunity within shortcoming of existing regime or agreements. So Arslan, the floor is yours to conclude our session.
Thank you very much, Han. I have to say one thing is that since we are shifting to a new era, I'm talking about the whole world, and with the issue of the Ukraine-Russia crisis, where during this crisis the nuclear weapon has been raised, or at least has been raised as a discourse. So we have to be aware that that this is a real threat for the new era, and we have to I think to focus and to emphasize on the nuclear disarmament within the region or within the whole world, as this threat has been raised during this crisis. We can imagine that it could be raised for or during other crises that could be developed in the next future.
Thank you, Arslan. And indeed, recent developments are still need to be completely understood as they unfold. And this is something that all of us are watching carefully and with concern. So I would like really to thank our speakers and those who asked questions. And with that, Tumisha, the floor is yours for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Chen. I guess there isn't much left for me to say after all the insights and discussions in the previous two sessions. What we've heard, I think, has been a very lively, frank, and candid discussion, with none of the speakers shying away from the difficult questions on the issue, which, I mean, I personally am very pleased to see, and I found very powerful and refreshing. I also hope that all of you in attendance have also found it useful and can take a lot from it for your own work on the issue. I don't want to keep everyone for much longer. So at this point, I would like to thank you all for joining us and contributing to the discussion with your interventions. I'd also like to thank Tom Markram again, who has had to leave early for another engagement, for offering his thoughts on the issue and the publication. We appreciate his support and the support of other ODA colleagues very much. Many of you might not realize, but this has been a work in the works for over a year and a half, I would say now. So at this point, it's really very important to me to give a special thanks to the authors that are all with us today, who have stuck with us and given us their time, knowledge, and patience throughout this long process. And I hope that those of you who haven't had the chance to read the report, which is on our website, that we've piqued your interest to do so. And of course, we always welcome your feedback and questions. I think my colleague Letitia will post a link in the chat to subscribe to our newsletter if you'd be interested in hearing more about our project. But otherwise, I just want to wish everyone a very enjoyable rest of the day, and hope to welcome you, hopefully in person, to a future event of the Middle East WMD Free Zone project. Thank you, everyone, so much.